everyone. This is Miss Hunt, second grade teacher at Philadelphia Elementary School. I have another story that I want to share with you guys, and I hope you like it. Today's tall tale is about John Henry. A tall tale, like other folk tales, were first told orally or shared by word of mouth. That means that these tales weren't written down for a long time, and everyone tells stories a different way. Tall tales more than likely became more exaggerated with each telling. This particular tall tale is interesting because for more than 100 years, we didn't know if the character of John Henry was a real person. Many years, people believed that John Henry was a fictional hero symbol and a symbol for those who worked laying the railroad tracks. But today, some historians, or people who study history, now believe that there was really a man named John Henry who really did lay railroad tracks, and that the main event in this story actually happened. The essential question for this fairy tale and tall tale domain is, what are the characteristics of fairy tales and tall tales? Remember, characteristics mean features or qualities. The focusing question for this particular lesson, John Henry, is how does this story show exaggeration? So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to tell how this story shows exaggeration. Today's vocabulary word for this particular lesson, John Henry, is feats. Feats are achievements that require courage or strength. As you listen to this story, see if you can find how John Henry overcame many feats. What are we waiting on? Let's get started. In the 1860s, the United States was growing quickly. Immigrants were pouring in, and railroad companies were laying train tracks that would carry settlers west. One of the railroad companies was called the Chesapeake and Ohio, or the C&O for short. The C&O Railroad was named for the two bodies of water it was intended to connect, the Chesapeake Bay along the east coast and the Ohio River in the west. The engineers who planned the C&O Railroad had to overcome many challenges in order to get the trains from the Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River, but no challenge was greater than this. They had to run their tracks through the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians were like big walls that separated the east from the west. Sometimes, when the mountains were rolling, more like hills, the C&O workers were able to lay tracks over the top of them. Other times, they were able to lay tracks that zigzagged around the mountains like a snake. But some mountains were too tall to go over and too big to go around. In those cases, the only solution was to dig a tunnel right through the mountain. A solution is something that solves a problem. Digging tunnels was dangerous work. The tunnels were dark and poorly ventilated. That means there was barely enough fresh air inside the tunnel for the workers to breathe. Many workers were killed by sudden cave-ins. Cave-ins were when pieces of rock fell down into the tunnel. To dig the tunnels as fast as they could, railroad workers worked in teams of two. One man would crouch down and hold a steel spike. Spikes are long, thick nails used to tie together railroad tracks. Then the other man would hit the spike with a big hammer. The first man would twist the spike as much as he could. Then his partner would hit the spike with his hammer again. The two men would work together, banging and twisting until they had driven the spike deep into the rock. Then they would pull out the spike and move to another spot and start digging a new hole. The men would create a hole in the rock by hand without the help of a complex machine. After a while, the rock would be full of holes like a piece of Swiss cheese. Next, the dynamite men would take over. Dynamite is a substance that explodes when it burns. The dynamite men would pack dynamite into the holes and detonate the explosives. Kaboom! Detonate means to set off. The explosions would break up the solid rock into the rubble. Then the workers would haul away the rubble, and then they would start digging again. To make the long, hard day's work go by faster, the railroad workers used to have contests. They would pick two teams and see which team could drive its spikes farther into the mountain in a set amount of time. The winners of these contests became heroes. People would tell stories about these steel-driving men and their amazing feats. Remember, feats are accomplishments that take great strength and determination. Another thing the railway workers did to pass time was to sing songs. Sometimes they would even sing songs about other steel-driving men. One of these steel-driving men was named John Henry. No one knew for certain where John Henry was from. Some said he was from Georgia, some said he was from Tennessee, others said he was a Virginian man. As it turns out, it seems likely that he was a former slave. He seems to have started working on the railroad sometimes after the end of the Civil War. For years, people thought that John Henry worked on the Big Bend Tunnel of the C&O line in what is now West Virginia, but now we think he more than likely worked on the Lewis Tunnel in Virginia. One thing we are sure of is that John Henry was a legend among railway workers. A legend is someone who is well known for doing something extremely well. A legend is also a story that is believed to be true, like this one. They sang a song that tells the story about how he was born with a hammer in his hand. Do you really think he was born with a hammer in his hand, or is this just an exaggeration? John Henry became known as the most courageous man who ever worked on the railroad. Even as a young boy, he could do the work of a man. That means even as a boy, John Henry could do the work of older men. Do you think he really could do that, or is that another exaggeration? They said that he had never been defeated in a steel driving competition. They said that he hit the spike so hard that sparks flew through the air. They said John Henry could swing a 10-pound hammer from sun up to sundown and never get tired. Could a person really do that, or is that just another exaggeration? At first, almost all of the work of the tunnel was done by hand by workers like John Henry. Eventually, however, this began to change. People invented machines that could do some of the work. One of the machines they invented was a steam drill. This was a drill that was powered by a steam engine. Very hot water changes to steam, which is what powers a steam drill. The first steam drills were pretty good, but they were not great. The steam drills could drive a spike into the mountain for sure, but not as well as two strong, experienced railway workers like John Henry and his partner. Over time, the machines got better and better, and they eventually began to replace the men who worked on the railroad tunnels. One day, the captain of John Henry's work team brought a steam drill to the work site. He bet that the steam drill could drive still better than John Henry could. This machine was going to do the same job as John Henry and his crew, but faster. John Henry agreed to compete against the steam drill, and he swore he would do his best to beat it. Compete means to have a contest to see who is better. John Henry said to the captain, "Well, a man ain't nothing but a man, but before I let a steam drill beat me down, I'll die with a hammer in my hand. Oh, I'll die with a hammer in my hand." This is a ballad. A ballad is a kind of poem or song that tells a story. One of the bosses blew a whistle. John Henry went to work driving steel the old-fashioned way with a hammer and a spike. The captain started up the steam drill. It rattled away beside John Henry, belching steam and banging away at the mountain. The man and the machine worked side by side for several hours. Then the boss blew his whistle again. The bosses took measurements, and then they announced the results. John Henry had driven his spike a total of 15 feet into the mountain. And the steam drill? It had only drilled 9 feet. That means John Henry had won. He had beaten the steam drill. Now the man that invented the steam drill, he thought he was mighty fine. But John Henry drove his 15 feet, and the steam drill only made 9. Oh, the steam drill only made 9. This is another excerpt from the Ballad of John Henry. The other railway workers roared. John Henry received a cheer as loud as a roar. They were excited that John Henry had won. He had shown that hard work was better than a machine, but John Henry himself was in no condition to celebrate. He had worked so hard that he had suffered a heart attack. John Henry hammered in the mountains, and his hammer was a striking fire. Well, he hammered so hard that it broke his poor heart, and he laid down his hammer and he died. Oh, oh, he laid down his hammer and he died. This is another excerpt from the Ballad of John Henry. The railway men carried John Henry out of the tunnel. They laid him to rest with the other workers who had died, but the legend of John Henry lived on. The C&O Railroad was completed a couple of years later, and for years to come, whenever locomotives went down the C&O line past the tunnel they thought John Henry helped dig, those who knew the story would say, "There lies John Henry, the king of the steel-driving men." They took John Henry down the tunnel, and they buried him in the sand. And every locomotive comes a-roaring by, says, "Yonder lies a steel-driving man. Oh, oh, yonder lies a steel-driving man." That's the end of the Ballad of John Henry. Now we're going to look at some discussion questions from the Tall Tale John Henry. After each questions, I will give you a little bit of time to answer the questions before we move on to the next. What parts of this story can really happen? What parts of this story are exaggerations? Why do you think people like to tell and hear the tall tale about John Henry? A steam drill is a machine that makes tunnels by digging holes in mountainsides. Why did people start using steam drills rather than relying on people to cut through rocks and mountains? At the beginning of this lesson, I gave you a focusing question. The focusing question was, how does the story show exaggeration? Think back to the story of John Henry and how exaggeration was shown. Enjoy this song about John Henry.
When John Henry was a little baby boy, you could hold him in the palm of your hand. He gave a long and lonesome cry, "Gonna be a steel driving man, Lord, Lord, gonna be a steel driving man." Well, the captain said to John Henry, "Gonna bring that steam drill round, gonna take that steam drill out on the job, gonna walk that steel on down, Lord, Lord, gonna walk that steel on down."
John Henry said to the captain, "Well, a man ain't nothing but a man, and before I let a steam drill beat me down, gonna die with a hammer in my hand, Lord, Lord, gonna die with a hammer in my hand." They took John Henry to the tunnel, put him in the lead to dry. The rock so tall, John Henry so small, that he laid down his hammer and he cried, "Lord, Lord," that he laid down his hammer and he cried.
John Henry said to a shaker, "Now shaker, why don't you sing? I'm throwing 9 pounds from my hips on down, just to listen to that cold steel ring, Lord, Lord, just to listen to that cold steel ring." Well, the man that invented the steam drill
John Henry looked up at the mountain, and his hammer was striking fire. He hammered so hard that he broke his heart.
And he laid down his hammer and he died, Lord, Lord. He laid down his hammer and he died.
They took John Henry to the tunnel. They buried him in the sand. Every locomotive comes roaring by, says, there lies a steel driving man, Lord, Lord. There lies a steel driving man.
If you enjoyed learning about John Henry, on Netflix, Walt Disney has an Animation Studios short films collection. The very first one that you will see is of John Henry. Thank you for taking your time today to listen to this tall tale about John Henry.